So Rabosa, we began yesterday the fourth parak of Yevamot, correct? And we got up to the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What happens? She was pregnant, the Yevamah, and despite that fact, the Yavam gave her chalitza. And then at the end, she had a miscarriage. She did not carry a viable baby to term and give birth to a viable baby. So Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that we can validate the chalitza, even though she was a muberes at that time, because he gloi milsa mafreya, that she wasn't really a muberes, I mean, so to speak. And the full-fledged zikas yibum was chal. If, on the other hand, he was miyabim her, even though she was pregnant at that time, it's irrelevant. The yibum is valid because she was a yavama. We didn't know it at that moment, but Klapi Shmai Gali up in heaven, they knew about it. When at the end of the day she miscarries, we can Lemafreya establish and determine that the original, whether it be Chalitza or Yibum, was valid. So we're up to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish Amar Tzricha Chalitza Min Ha'achim. Why? Because chalitzas meuberes lo shmei chalitza, ubias meuberes in the case of Yibum lo shmei bir. But my kamifi, iboy say makra, iboy say maspara, iboy say makra, iboy say maspara. Rabbi Yochanan Savar im yovel yov yomer do iabra mapule mapla is milav. Bas chalitza b'yibumi, ashtenami tigle milsa lemafreya. We understand Rabbi Yochanan's logic. It's pretty straightforward. We have to clarify, if we only could, whether or not this pregnancy is a real pregnancy, so to speak. I'm going to just start using that term for pedagogic purposes. If Eliyahu Hanavi would clarify for us that this is not a real pregnancy, so here too, although we don't have Eliyahu Hanavi to clarify, but nevertheless, the reality itself is, as the story unfolds, the Sofo Shel Davar, she miscarried. And that's called Tigloi Milsa Mafreya. So now we clarify that the Chalitza was a valid Chalitza, the Yibum was a valid Yibum. There's no need for a replacement chalitza. There was a lack of clarity. Now we have a birur, we have a clarification. Lakish Omar, Tigle Milsa Mafreya Lo Amri. Why not? He writes here, Ein Omrim Dover Zeh She'achar Shehuvrav Shavlad Nefel Mevar L'Mafreya Al Chalitza Shehi Tova. I wouldn't write the word Tova here. Elabodkin B'Shas HaChalitza B'Im Oz Himu Beres Chalitzasa Psula Utzricha Chalitza Nosefes. I don't understand. I mean, is Reish Lakish rejecting the whole concept of Igloi Milsa Mafreya? I mean, that's a universal concept that
They say in this case.
Yeah. What's different about this case? I mean, the Gemara just says, Tiglei Milsum Afrei Lo Agreed. Why? Chumran Arayis. I don't know. Say it again. Yeah, I understand what you say, but somebody has to say that.
This is the ritual explains.
What's he saying?
Let's say what it's just.
Oh, he tells you. We could get a ritual here, by the way. It should be on the other side of this wall. If you want to look at the ritual, that could be. I mean, very difficult to say that we don't apply the principle of double of affair. I have something in the back here. I have something in the back here called Yalkut Bi'uri. Let me just see if he quotes the Ritva in the back. Hey, do we own now? Lamed Hey. Okay, let me just see. Hey, Lamed Beis.
Well, so it's here. Tosfos explains that Reish Lakish rejects the use of retrospective application only in cases like the present one, the true status is physically unknowable. Would agree that
unknowable?
Unknowable.
I never saw that word. Yeah, makes sense. You see, if I said that word, my wife would make fun of me. Yeah. Hey, my wife always accused me of making up, new words. Yeah, unknowable. Yeah, go ahead.
But he would agree that we say the matter is revealed in retrospect in cases where the present status is not unknowable.
Not unknown.
That's the unknown.
Unknown. Unknown and unknown. But that he's saying in the name of Tosfos. But the Ritva, right? The Ritva he doesn't tell you. So let me just look here for a second and see if by chance he quotes the Ritva. I'm so tempted to think that this whole Reish Lakish is a D'Rabbanan. It's not a D'Oraisa. Oh, you want to do me a favor, John? You hold on to this because I'm going to read a summary of the Ritva from the back of the Masifta, and let's compare notes. You look in the Ritva in the original, and I'll look here in the summary. Okay, he says the following: Haritva b'shem Moro. I don't know if you find such a thing that he quotes his Rebbe. I think his Rebbe is the Rashba, but I don't know. I may be making a mistake. Maybe the Ritva was 100 years later. I don't know. Reish Lakish Choshe Shema Biosa Shah Reuya Hoysa Loledes Vavlad Hoya Vlad Gom V'Achakach Is Orer Gorem Shegaram Lo Lahapi. You should know this thought crossed my mind, but I never really thought about it. You know what I mean? Maybe at that time the Vlad was viable. That's what we call, I think, a stillborn. Very tragic, where a woman carries 9 months and she had what are those grams? What are those things called? Like an X-ray. What are they called today? The most sophisticated, less radar. What's it called, John? Help me out. Ultrasound. So she had ultrasounds, and they said everything's fine. And then gave birth to a dead baby. It's horrible. The halacha requires kfura, and I think al pi kabbalah you have to do a bris milah if it's a boy. It's horrible. It's so horrible. A woman carries 9 months. But anyway, the Ritva is saying that the possibility exists that this was a viable baby at the time of the chalitza. Imkena chalitza may kara lav chalitza hi klal. Ulakach Omer Reish Lakish Igloi Miltzum Afreya Lo Amrina. No, you can't say Igloi Miltzum Afreya if the Metzius changed. You can always say we didn't know what the Metzius is, and now we can clarify retroactive. But if the Metzius was X and now it changed to Y, you can't say Lo Mafreya. Ulreish Lakish Medubar b'matzav shel sav. Im hoya ha'umar bar kayoma v'achar kach nischadsha siba shegarma lapola so mikara uber lo haya bar kampara kayoma. So again, today we have an ultrasound. Maybe we could clarify that with in the absence of ultrasound, how would we know whether or not a new situation happened? Maybe she got a bang. I don't know what could have happened, or the baby just didn't develop. Or from the get-go, the baby was not a viable being. So we can't clarify that. We don't have an ultrasound. The ultimate ultrasound would be Eliyahu Hanavi, but we don't have Eliyahu Hanavi right. L'chein zui chalitza misupekes utzricha chalitza nosefes mitzah. So again, he's not saying it's the Rabbanan. That far he's not going, the Ritva. But he is classifying it as a chalitza misach. And I mean, that changes the whole sugi, because then Reish Lakish has no problem with mafreya. He has a problem with mafreya because we don't know whether or not this is a mafreya, it's a birur, it's a giui, or it's a new ball game, a new set of a new reality. Ubir b'birkas Shmuel. The Birkas Shmuel is, right? That's the Talmud of Reb Chaim, right? Reb Shmuel Leibovitz. Shalafi Dvarov Yotze Shereish Lakish Modeli. Shekivanti. Yes, Shereish Lakish Moda. He embraces Lietzim Asfar Damir Gilu Milsa Aglai Milsa Mafreya. Became Kosav Mishnah Lamela. I mean, that really puts us in a whole different category. I mean, Baruch Hashem, it makes me much more comfortable to know that Reish Lakish accepts the principle of Igloi Milsa Mafreya. El the shiny office, Shenkan Gilu Milsa Mafreya came to be Korah Havi of Vlad Bar Kayom. Maybe initially the Vlad was fine. See, here I don't know. There's something missing here, a little piece of the puzzle. Maybe it's a drasha that I'm missing that proves that the Torah, in a case of a woman who's pregnant after her husband dies, and the Vlad right now, Asher Usham, at this moment in time, is viable, there's no Yibum, no Chalitz. I would have said that the halacha only changes after the birth, but during pregnancy, it's not a Vlad. So we're saying no. If the Vlad was fine and healthy at that moment of time, there was no Yibum and no Chalitz. We don't know. It's very possible that the Vlad was already on its way to death. It wasn't viable. But on the side that it was viable, Lefi that side, if let's say Eliyahu Hanavi would testify that this was a perfectly viable baby, and later on, sometime in the balance of a pregnancy, the baby died or whatever it is, then in that case, the chalitza is a chalitza psula.
The baby's still viable because they died. How can you say it's viable before?
No, something happened. She fell. I don't know. She got a mako. I don't know. The climate change. I don't know. Whatever it is. Again, the whole premise of the Ritva is that there are two possibilities. Either at time T1, the time of the chalitza, the baby was already doomed to death, if you want to call it a trait, or whatever word you want to call it, on its way to be a nefel, or no, it was a perfectly viable baby and something else happened down the line. And that's why it was never born the way a normal baby is born. That's the Ritva's premise. I don't know enough biology to criticize the Ritva. Intuitively, sounds like it's correct. Maybe she had a fall, whatever it is.
We're saying that if a pregnant woman falls and the baby dies, that
she now falls for Yibum. She needs Yibum or Chalitza.
We're not worried.
So that's why I don't understand. Why is the Chalitza invalid before the baby is born. It's just an ubar b'mei imo. Is that enough to remove a zikas ilu? That to me is a chiddush.
So we're presuming that the baby's born.
We don't know either way. So the Ritva says, what do you say?
If we're saying that he has to have the calypso, we're presuming the baby's born. Only
on that side that the baby was viable, which is a 50% chance in the Ritva's mind. The chalitza is completely possible b'shaita because then the vlad was alive and well. There's no yibum, there's no zika, it's garbage. The chalitza is meaningless. Later on, you need another chalitza because when the baby dies, then for some reason the zikas yibum is chosav. That's the problem that I don't have solved over here. How does the death of the baby, when it becomes a nafel, how does that now regenerate a yibum? Apparently, the question of yibum is an ongoing question. Like, I'll give you another example. It's not a good sushtel, but if, let's say, Ruvain had a baby, and the baby never died, and then Ruvain died, so then his wife will be yibum. It's not that if there's 1 second in time where he left the zera, shel kayama, that we remove the yibum and the zikas yibum forever and ever. That's not so. We have to determine at the time of his death whether he left zera or not. If he had zera, but never there was a tragedy and he lost the zera, then there will be yibum. So that's what we have for the Ritva. Does the text of the Ritva seem to reflect that? Yeah. Okay. So that's the Baruch there. However, he says b'tosvis, rosh mevur, shetam shel reish lakish, the law amrinin tigloi milsam afreya, u'mishum she'ein zechi soren yidia, ma hamatzav b'yosel zman, v'chagav namrinin tigloi milsam afreya, samchinin al elio, el hasofik hu ma yeh b'osid shel ha'ubar. ובחי גבנה שהסופק ומה יהיה ביוסי, לא סמכינן על עליו. ולא אמרינן תגלי מילסל מפרד. I didn't understand a word of what I just read. I have a good Shabbos. So again, Hatam shel Reish Lakish, the lo amrinon Loi milsim afreya, mishum she'ein zeh chisaron yidia, ma hamatzav bi'oso zman. Again, if we don't know what the situation was at that time, the time of the chalitza, then even Reish Lakish would agree that he loi milsim afreya. But rather, in other words, we're not asking what is the situation of the Uber now at this moment of Chalitz. That's not the issue. Even though intuitively that's how we saw it because we're influenced by the Ritva. But Tosfos has a different approach. If it was only what is the reality at the time of the chalitza, then even Reish Lakish would agree. Let's ask Elio enough, and then the chalitza would be a perfectly valid chalitza, and even Reish Lakish agrees. Why does Reish Lakish disagree? Because the suffix is not on that moment in terms of what does the baby look like, in the ultrasound, but rather the suffix is how ma yeh bi osid shalav. What is the prediction for the future of the Uber? And therefore, Reish Lakish holds that if the suffix is ma yeh bi osid, then we can't rely on Elio. Elio can't tell me what's going to be in the future, I guess, or at least in the symbolism.
Very strange concept.
Wait a second, give me a minute. I think something is sinking in over me, but it's slow. It's moving through the various layers here in my brain. Ma yeh osid shel ha'ubar. Yeah, Asid Shalom. I just want to underline those words. I have a feeling that Tosfos is very much on our page. Remember, we were asking the status of Yibum in the case of a pregnant woman really depends on the laid. It's not the Uber per se. I mean, the Uber per se is not enough to be mafkia, to completely remove and undermine Yibum. Because you need a vla, you need a zera. Where does he leave a child? He left an Uber. I don't know if an Uber is enough to remove Yibum. So that's called al shema asi in the language of Tosfos. That enough hinami, the ptur of Yibum and Avkaz Zika is not because the vlad right now is viable, even if Eliyahu Hanavi would tell me, and we can't question Eliyahu Hanavi, he clarifies the absolute reality that this vlad at the moment of Chalitza was valid, was alive and well. Something later happened. That's not what goes on. Because that itself would not be enough to be mafkia zikasib. But rather, the question of whether the chalitza is valid is a question of anticipating the future. And in his language, he says, "Sofik humayeh bi asid shalom." We have to know what's going to be at the time of the later. That's going to remove the evil. And in such a case, we can't apply the principle of Igloy Milsim Afre.
But don't we need to wait 30 days after the birth and it's Papiam?
Possibly. I don't know. We didn't get to that question. But what we're trying to focus our attention is the way Tosfos sees two categories of cases that are fundamentally different, one from the other, and the nafkamina will determine whether or not we apply the mafrei. We're really getting into very deep sugyas here. This is very profound. It's not that Reish Lakish denies the mafrei. I mean, we saw that already in the Ritva. Just the Ritva says that there is no mafrei because at the time of the chalitza, the baby was fine and alive, doing well, thriving, was growing. Tosfos agrees that Reish Lakish fundamentally is on board with Lamafreya, but it depends what kind of suffix you have. There are two fundamentally different categories of suffix. In category number A, there is Lamafreya, and Reish Lakish doesn't doubt it. But then there's category number B, which is a different kind of a suffix, and here's where Reish Lakish says, Adkan, there's no Lamafreya. There's no din of Lamafreya. What is that second category? When it's a suffix al ma osid lios. See, we said before that according to the Ritva, tzricha chalitza, the second chalitza, the misafik. Now I think we're saying according to Tosfos, tzricha chalitza mibad, because there's no lamafreya. And why is there no lamafreya? Because the nature of the suffix doesn't lend itself to lamafreya. You can't say lamafreya when the determination is the legal determination is in the future. Lamafreya means let's go back to the past. I didn't know about the past. Now I can clarify the past. If the reality of the past is what generates the legal change, the legal chalos, then you can talk about Mafreya and Reish Lakish. There's no problem with that. It'll also be on board with Mafreya. But when it's not that we're trying to go back into time and we're going to try to figure out now that we're smart, what was the situation earlier, which if we can clarify, let's say with Eliyahu Novi, then Reish Lakish is all totally on board. Yeah, rah, rah, rah. We're going to say that the chalitza is a valid chalitza. But rather, the suffix is of a different nature. What's going to happen tomorrow? And the situation tomorrow, at the end of the 9-month period, that's going to determine whether or not she needs chalitza, whether or not there's a zikas evil. There's no way you can say Lamasa. Because the critical time that generates the chalos is not time T1 at the time of the chalitza, but time T2 at the time she gave birth. Wow, I mean, this is very profound. This is like what my Rebbe would call a tells hakir. In tells they were very famous for philosophical hakirs. Is the cup half empty or half filled? Amish wild. Iboy same a crow. Rabbi Yochanan Sovar. The Torah says "Uben ein lo Omar Achmona." The Torah says that if it's ben ein lo, then he falls for yibum. Then she falls for yibum. Veha leslie. Right? It's ben ein lo. The Torah says if it's ben ein lo, then there's yibum. And this is ben ein lo. Again, we didn't know whether it was ben ein lo or not at the time of the chalitza, but since we clarify it at the end of this 9-month period, when the baby turns out never to be a nefa, then we know it's ben ein lo. You can't say that there was a ben and the ben is no longer. It's ben ein lo. We now clarify that it's ben ein lo. We didn't know, but now we know. And once we know that the chalitza was a perfectly valid chalitza. There's no need for a second chalitza. Shlokish Sovar uben ein lo ayin olav. Ayin olav means try to investigate and determine whether or not he left a ben. But you have to be sure that he did not leave a ben. That has to be absolute certain. That's called ayin olav. Establish uben ein lo as a definite. If it's not ayin olav, if it's not definite, then you don't have uben ein lo. And if you don't have uben ein lo, one second. Ayin olav. I thought I had it. Now I see maybe I don't have it. Ayin olav. Right? Check out and find out whether he has a ben. And let's say now we cannot know whether he has a ben or not. So then, if it's not ayin olav, then there is no nefila liyibum. That's what I missed that. Right. So the Torah says uben ein lo, and then she falls for yibum. Anything less than uben ein lo, which now we're saying going to something, it's got to be definite. Ayin olav. Is then there's no nefila for yibum. So since you cannot establish ayin olav uben ein lo in the case of chalitza muberes, therefore there's no mitzvah yibum, there's no zika, therefore the chalitza is invalid. He says here, kol zman shehi muberes, the ein yodua. You see, I would add the word vada. If the ein yodua bevada, that's what I think he means. Right? So we don't know for sure, yesh lo ben or ein lo ben, puts it up in the air. Is there ein chalitza sa chalitza? Because what would generate a zikas yibum would be uben elo ayin olav. So there's no possibility of applying a mafreya in this explanation of Reish Lakish, because at the moment of chalitza, we did not have the clarity, the definite certainty that this uvar would turn out to be a nefa. And if we didn't have that ayin olav of uben elo, then we don't have yibum. You've got to know for sure at the time of the chalitza that he leaves no zera. It's uben elo. Then the chalitza is valid because then there is a zikas yibum. But if on the other hand, we don't know one way or the other, does he have a ben? Does he not have a ben? Again, we'll clarify that later on. But at the time of the chalitza, we don't have uben elo. We don't have ayin olah. Are we happy with this? Reish Lakish make any sense? Torah is saying that right now, whether or not there is a zikas yibum depends on whether or not we have a definite uben eno. So Lamafrey is not going to help you. All the clarifications that you'll have later on when she gives birth to a nefel is not going to in any way solve your problem of uben elo, because we need uben elo as a precondition at the time of the chalitza, because we need uben elo in order to generate a zikas yibum. I have a feeling that according to this Iboy say Makra, we're not looking for logic. This is Xeris HaKos. This is what we derive from the Torah. The Torah says it's got to be Ben Elo. It's kind of like innocent until proven guilty. What do I mean? She is assumed to be a free agent to marry any man she wants, and she doesn't have a zika to anybody until you could prove for sure that she has a zika. So in order to prove that she has a zika, we need uben elo ayin olav. In the absence of uben elo ayin olav, then she goes back to original chazaka, original status of heter, without the, how should I say, the heavy bonds of zika that inhibit her and prevent her from getting married to anyone else. Once you get to the point of uben elo ayin olav, then you could have a valid chalitza.
Why can't chalitza be valid?
Say it again.
Why can't chalitza be valid?
I don't think we can, I don't think, David, we have an answer to that question in the second shot. Again, if you ask me in the first shot, why say Mispara, that's a valid question, and why I have to answer the question why. But I suspect that in the Ibai say Makra, it's not even valid to ask the question why. The Torah says that she's not in a state of zikas yibum until you can fulfill the condition of uben elo ayin olav.
Yeah, but if she's
That's how Reish Lakish understood the
particularly
pasuk.
ridiculous stuff, so by giving chalitza, just like again, some of the problems anything.
But later on, when we get to the point that the zikas yibum emerges, because it's uben elo ayin olav, when we get to the point when we know that the vlad is a what do you call it? Is not viable. What's it called? Is a nefel. At that point, she needs chalitza. Why does she need chalitza? Rabbi Yochanan is yelling at you. She already had chalitza. Why does she need another chalitza? The answer is because there was no zikas yibum at that moment when he gave her chalitza. She was in a state of freedom. She's an almana. She can marry anyone she wants. She's not bound by zika. Why? Because it's not uben elo.
Has got the clothes like a get? Is it clothes like a get?
No, but a chalitza is like a get if there's zikas even. For example, I walk over to a woman and I give her a get. A woman off the street, and then I marry her. That get is not valid. Get can only be valid if at the moment that I deliver the get, there's issues. And chalitza can only be valid if there's a zikas yibum at the time of the chalitza. So he did a very nice ceremony, a ritual of chalitza. Did a great job with a nal. You remember we discussed, whether it has soft leather or not, or hard leather. It's meaningless. Why? Because the zika is a result of uben elo ayinov. You and I would have said uben elo. We don't know, so we have to clarify. No. Says Reish Lakish. It's not a matter of clarification. You have an ayin olah. If you don't have an ayin olah, then there's no zika. It's like walking down the street giving a woman chalitza. Imagine if there are two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven's married to Leah, and Shimon comes and gives chalitza to Leah when Reuven is alive and well. It's meaningless. Reuven dies later. He's going to have to repeat the chalitza. Lo zer klum. It's not going to help. Whole new shot in Reish Lakish. In my mind, this is a radically different shot in Reish Lakish. All right, we'll stop here. I wonder if at any point the Gemara is going to ask my beinayu, like, is there a nafkamina between the two? I'm not sure if this Gemara of Iboy Sem Mikra, Iboy Sem Svara is exactly classic. I'm not sure. Like, there's a famous question of Jim and Chkov. Again, it's like a tells the type of question. If Shimon was bothered, how can you say Iboy same as Svara? We don't create halachas based on Svara. You could always say that once you have a pasuk and you have the alfusa, then you apply svara. But here you're saying iboy same a kra, and if you don't have the kra, iboy same a svara. Well, what's the basis for that? Rabbi Shimon was very bothered by it. How can you say iboy same a svara? I have a feeling that this particular sugya would not bother Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Shkop would not ask this question in this context because here the svara is, let's say according to the Ritva, the svara of Reish Lakish is that we really don't know, and we can never really know whether or not this blood was a nafel at the time of the chalitza. And the Lamafreya is not going to help you because you cannot clarify Lamafreya. What was the status of the blood at the time of the chalitza? That's as far I don't think would bother if she. If you go with Tosfos, Tosfos is saying it's a different type of suffix. It's a suffix al shema asid, and there's no Lamafreya on a suffix al shema asid. I think therefore Reb Shimon would have no problem with ours. In other sugyas, when the Gemara says Iboy Seim Svara, Reb Shimon is saying, what do you mean Iboy Seim Svara? You're going to be machadish something based on Svara. For example, that there's a machlokus where the chinuch is on the father or on the son. Very famous, I think the Minchas Chinuch already has it. So Reb Shimon asks, what are you talking about? Chinuch on the son? The son is not chayiv in mitzvah. So why is he chayiv in chinuch? So Reb Shimon says, Iboy Seim Svara. You see where this Iboy Seim Svara could be taken, from here till I don't know where. All right, I wish you a great Shabbos. Thank you.